So the fall 2024 anime season is now upon us, and do you know what that means? It means that it's once again time for me to strap in for probably 40 plus new shows to push myself through in the span of just a week or two. Me being the obsessive completionist weirdo that I am, I just can't stop myself from checking out at least the first episode of every single new anime related thing that I can get my eyeballs on, and oh boy, what a joy that is. So what shows are good this season? Or maybe you want to see someone bitch about everything that's completely awful. Is there any chance you want to hear anything about the mediocre stuff? Well, all of that is coming up. Here are some time codes if you want to skip to just one of the categories. There are also time codes for every individual show in the description. I know the title says just best and worst anime, but I'll actually be talking a bit about everything that I've watched so far, which is pretty much everything new that has currently aired. There are however a lot of sequels that I won't be watching this season, either because I've dropped these shows in the past or because I've simply never started watching them. These are those. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's kick things off with the good stuff. Starting with this show absolutely exploded onto the scene for me as I had no idea what to expect when putting on the first episode. I don't usually look through the seasonal charts too much beforehand as I know I'll be checking everything out either way, so this episode really blew me away with how visually creative it was and how bombastic it was with its tone. And yes, just in case anyone is confused, the title of this series is actually just Dandadan. Given the fact that this is the most popular show on my anime list this season, I'm sure all of you already know about this one, but I'll do a quick rundown of it regardless. This extremely colorful and fun lady gets dumped by some dude that she liked because he reminded her of some childhood crush or something like that. She later runs into this nerdy looking guy and they have a big argument where one side is convinced aliens exist and the other is convinced ghosts exist. And so to prove their point, they both tell the other to go to some known power spot and see for themselves, and obviously they both turn out to be correct in their beliefs. So the dude has his dick stolen by a ghost called the Turbo Granny, and our funny lady is about to have her virginity stolen by aliens. But then the dude teleports to her through her phone, and then the lady realizes she has telekinetic powers and they totally mess up the aliens in the most visually spectacular animation sequence that I've seen in a long ass time. It is difficult to overstate just how on point all of the dialogue is too while all of this crazy shit is happening, and the comedic tone is excellent for the duration of pretty much the entire episode. The voice actors of the main duo do an especially fantastic job to really drive all of this home. With the way I've described it, it probably sounds like it is just some random shock humor, and while this is maybe true to some extent, the presentation handles it in such an absurdly assertive way that it all lands wonderfully. The episode also has a wide range of variety in its tone, and there are plenty of moments that feel downright emotional even in a more traditional sense. This episode takes wonderful advantage of many of the strengths of the animated medium to provide something that just oozes creativity. What is animation about if not to create something that is visually explosive while also telling a completely off-the-rails story? This first episode is one that I'm sure just about anyone would be able to enjoy, and if there is any chance that someone is listening to this without having seen it, you should totally go watch it. I know I'm sold on it at the very least, and I'll be sticking with this show until it ends. Even if the show somehow takes a complete nosedive and turns to shit, at least I'll get to see this fantastic opening again and again. By the way, did you know that the opening song is done by Creepy Nuts? It's pretty groovy, man. And double, by the way, did you know that the ED song is done by Sutomayo? This shit goes hard. What is it with sports anime and the color blue? In just recent memory, we've had Aoashi, Blue Lock, and now No Hako. Completely irrelevant questions aside, this show here is kind of awesome. I'm likely the least sporty person that you'll ever come across, but I have a real soft spot for shows where a bunch of people just work hard towards their goals, and this is basically what a lot of sports shows boil down to. I also kind of enjoy cute romance and such, and as it so happens, some exceptionally cute romance is also a part of this show, making for a very delectable genre sandwich indeed. This badminton dude called Taiki has a crush on this basketball lady called Chinatsu. Chinatsu is the big MVP of the basketball team and she has big ambitions to go far with her team at this school. But oh no, her family is moving to another country or something. Taiki then has a big freak out when he finds her at his home and learns that she is now going to be living with them instead. And so begins a series of super cute exchanges between these two endearing characters as they strive for their goals to be exceptional athletes together. Most narrative works prioritize one of two things, either the characters or the plot. And in a show like this, the characters are what end up being the most important element. So thankfully, the characters here are incredibly enjoyable and likable. Especially the female lead Chinatsu is so absurdly adorable that even I can't help but feel an embarrassing sense of affection towards her. But don't tell my girlfriend that, okay? This lady is quite possibly the best girl of this whole season. In my experience, romance shows rarely nail both the male and female lead. Usually only one of them end up being truly interesting, but here I feel like the show could easily be carried by either one of them on their own. And that isn't even mentioning the fact that many of the supporting characters are pretty great too, which makes for just an absurdly comforting watch. This show also has needlessly good animation and many of the character designs look absolutely wonderful, making it even easier to understand why our main dude would be so infatuated with our main girl. Chinatsu's voice actor, Ueda Reina, also pulls out an especially great performance here which further elevates her character. It often seems like a lot of people in the more mainstream demographic more or less needs a clear plot in order to find a show interesting, and I've never really been able to relate to that. I'd like to say that I'd recommend this show to just about anyone, but at the same time I'm aware that there's probably lots of people that would find this boring on account of it being so character focused rather than plot focused. But if you have any interest in romance or sports anime, you should probably give this show at least one episode. I'd say you're missing out on something pretty special otherwise. This is one of those shows that makes me sit with a dumb grin on my face while I watch it, and I'm super eager to see more of it. I can't wait to get even more jealous of the main guy as this relationship develops further. I'm a pretty simple guy. I like cute anime girls and I think Japan is a really cool place. So shows that feature cute girls in a modern Japanese setting strongly appeal to my own preferences and makes it especially easy for me to appreciate those kinds of shows. It is then particularly impressive how a show that is basically the antithesis of that managed to be one of my favorite shows of the season so far. Chikyuu no Undou ni Tsuite is set in 15th century Poland and follows a young dude and some old guy in their quest to do astronomy. Our main guy, Rafal, is a brilliant mind with an ambition for stars and the shape of the universe, but he has the misfortune of growing up in an era where the church abuses their authority to silence any theory that would go against their teachings, punishing blasphemy with torture and death. At first, Rafal himself doesn't question what he has been taught his whole life, but then he meets a former heretic who sends him down the dangerous path to discover the truth and thus risk being labeled a heretic himself. The Earth isn't at the center of the universe, not even at the center of our own galaxy. That would be the Sun. Obvious knowledge today, but an idea that could get you burned alive 500 years ago. Science is kind of awesome, and the fact that our species has accomplished so many unthinkable things is nothing short of amazing. Getting to see where discoveries like these were first made and the process in which they developed and took shape is incredibly cool and interesting, even if it is also frustrating to be reminded of just how much religion has hampered technological progress in the past and just how many innocent lives have been wrongfully taken. This series has the capacity to be incredibly grim, but this is done to spectacular effect. The risks feel truly intimidating, and the way our main characters continue to pursue what they believe in even in spite of the mortal danger is super compelling. The dialogues are very well written and the overall presentation feels absolutely excellent. The dynamic between our two main dudes work fantastically too, and they're a lot of fun to watch. Even the bad guys are given the same treatment. For example, this reoccurring torturer is not edgy or obnoxious. He's not violent for the sake of violence or to induce some kind of cheap shock value. He is truly intimidating and his character is portrayed incredibly tastefully. I've watched all 3 available episodes of this show at the time of writing this, and there are a few things that I want to mention that would qualify as being some pretty major spoilers, so don't listen any further if you care about spoilers. I would easily recommend this show to anyone. It may very well be my favorite series of the season at this point. Go watch this if you haven't, it's great. It's criminal how far down this is on the My Anime List chart. Okay, I'm going to talk about spoilers now. The first episode really sold me on our main duo. This young naive kid and this cynical old man had some really interesting conversations that managed to be quite thought-provoking for me, and I was eager to see more of it. Imagine my dismay when this old man was killed off in the very next episode. I didn't really expect that the show would be so bold as to kill off such an interesting character just like that. Holy shit. I was a bit skeptical after this, being unsure over how the show would carry on with just the kid remaining. How would things progress with just this single character driving the story forward? Well, rest assured, the next episode was still excellent. We're still working closer towards the goal of proving the theory of heliocentrism, and the pace and tone still hold up well. But then the kid goes and dies too, and suddenly we're skipping 10 years into the future. Hello? What is even going on, man? This show is supposed to be 25 episodes long, but both characters that I assumed would be the main characters are now gone in just the first 3 episodes. How would they possibly replace either of these characters that I'm already invested in? That's just cruel, man. Also, this scene in episode 3 where Raphael talks to the torturer is pretty damn great. The way the tone goes back and forth and the apathetic state of Raphael as he explains his suicide is enough to give you chills. The way the torturer mistakenly assumes that he had been poisoned was also really cool, and this highlights just how much he values his own self-preservation. I really have no idea how the show is going to proceed after this. I have trouble imagining new characters being as interesting as Raphael and Hubert, but I guess I'll see what happens. I'm also a bit suspicious over the fact that Raphael has a very big role in both the OP and the ED, so a part of me wonders if he is really dead. Is he really going to remain in the OP for another 10 episodes even if he died in the first 3? But it did seem like he was burned to ash, so I really don't know how he would recover from that. Who knows, I'm certainly excited to see where things go from here. Super cool show. I hope others are having a good time with it too. What would you do if you would be told that you only had 2 years left to live? Take a big loan and live like a king for the remaining duration? Maybe just completely panic? Or would you maybe be in the mood to go fishing? Yeah, that's gotta be it. NegaPosi Angler follows our main character as his life kind of collapses, which leads him to meet a bunch of people who are super into fishing. Seeing things unfold from the perspective of someone who doesn't have much time left puts a lot of things into an interesting perspective. Most of us probably take a lot of things in our lives for granted because it is just natural to do so. We rarely realize what we have until it's gone, and so on. But for me, this show has acted like a reminder to appreciate the little things in life, and I rather like that. Anyway, our main guy gets told by the doctor that he's got 2 years left. He then sulks a bit at home until he gets chased by loan sharks and eventually ends up with a group of fishers. Then he comes home to find his apartment now a pile of rubble, so he's certainly playing life on some serious ultra nightmare difficulty. This overall premise where a main character gets into a new hobby after finding a friendly bunch of people is a pretty typical one in slice of life anime, but it's certainly one that is totally up my alley. Seeing people just pursue the things they love with passion is super cool to me, and this is no exception. The dynamic between our main guy and the rest of the group is pretty entertaining on account of the sharp contrast, as most of the others are super cheery while he is the cynical and tired husk. Kind of like me actually. Especially this lady with the crazy hair was particularly likable, and the way she stands up for her hobby when people badmouth it is super cute. But seriously, what is going on with her hair? Anyway, this appears to be a show about a guy who has given up on life finding his purpose again. I can't really see this show going either way. Maybe it will go all in on being an emotional redemption story where this guy finds a reason to live again and fights whatever disease he has to stay alive and pursue his new passions. Or maybe it will just kind of coast along as an uneventful slice of life show about fishing. I'm probably on board either way, honestly. I was a bit on the fence in regards to whether or not I was going to include this show in this category of good stuff, as it is kind of unremarkable in many ways and definitely not a show for everyone. So maybe you could consider this an honorable mention of sorts. For me, it definitely deserves this place more than any other show this season, minus the above 3 of course. If you're into slice of life stuff like me, or if you have any interest in fishing, then maybe you could check this show out. Okay, the Off and Monster season of the Monogatari series isn't a new show for this fall season, but can I please just appreciate the fact that I am living through a time where more of this show is currently airing. Like holy shit, to think we could be this blessed. Shaft has cooked once more and provided some seriously peak content. Getting to see the gang again in a modern adaptation is so damn surreal and so damn spectacular. If you're not watching the Monogatari series, you're missing out. Anyway, I just wanted to soak in some positivity before moving on to all of the bad shows, but I guess that time has now come. Alright, so that is everything that has managed to really impress me so far in this new season. Listing only 4 new shows might seem cynical, but I guess that's just how it goes when you waste as much time watching anime as I do. If anything, I'd say it's mighty impressive that there are a full 4 new shows that managed to provide me with such a good time. But of course, that number completely pales in comparison to the total. If you have any interest in listening to me bitch about all of the garbage that I watched too, then by all means stick around. And yes, of course I do realize that taste differs from person to person. This is just my own opinion as a cynical and nerdy dude who watches an unhealthy amount of Japanese cartoons. If you like any of these upcoming shows, then that is totally cool. Art is subjective. I'm going to be keeping myself pretty short for most of these upcoming shows. To be honest, I didn't even plan on making this video until after I had already watched most of these episodes, so I didn't take any notes or even really pay all that much attention. I also usually watch these less promising anime shows at 4 times speed in my media player just to have any chance at all of staying awake, but this obviously comes at the consequence of maybe missing some minor details here and there. Anyway, let's just get right into it. To start us off, we've got Maou 2099. This has basically all of the typical hallmarks of your average light novel fantasy slop, but just in a somewhat different setting. Some hero defeats some demon lord, but then the demon lord resurrects ages later in some futuristic Japan setting and wants revenge or a rematch with the hero or something to that effect. It took about 30 seconds until I had lost interest in this episode, as it does this annoying thing where it opens with some sort of battle waged between characters that I know nothing about and thus don't care about at all at this point. It's also remarkably off-putting in terms of its visual, so that was certainly not doing it any favors. The overall presentation did actually hold up better than I had initially expected as the episode went on, but this isn't exactly a compliment as my expectation was the lowest it could possibly be. I would say that this episode had at least a bare minimum level of cohesiveness and appeal when it comes to the overall premise, but this potential is completely lost on me as it is carried out by cringy characters, ugly visuals and obnoxious dialogues. Their representation of a futuristic society is also super shallow to me and uses many of the common visual shorthands for what vaguely comes across as futuristic. Also, are you trying to tell me that this is what VTubing looks like in the year 2099? Dude, this is what VTubing looks like today. Come on now. Hitoribocchi no Isekai Kouryaku is just another in what seems to be an endless line of pretty much the same show being made over and over again. If you've seen one show about some loner and his classmates getting isekai'd only for him to eventually end up super strong due to his unusual abilities and whatever, then you have already seen this one too. This show is ugly, the gaming systems of this fantasy world feel super stupid, and the characters have about as much personality as a pile of bricks. I'll never understand how these cheap shovelware isekai shows keep getting made. Don't watch this one unless you really love this premise and you've already seen all other shows that do this better. Oh look, it's another Hamefura clone. Rekishi no Nokoru Akujo ni Naru is yet another show that tries to clone the formula of a show from 2020 called Otomegemu no Hametsu Flagushikanai Akuyaku Reiju no Tensei Shiteshimata, or Hamefura for short. Hamefura ended up getting pretty damn big in Japan, which is probably why imitators have spawned since then. If you're not at all familiar with these shows, the premise is that a girl enters the world of an otome game and takes the role of the villainess, getting the chance to influence the game world and the typical game progression to steer things away from her character eventually being banished for her evil deeds or something to that effect. Or well, I guess in this show here her goal is instead to just become some supervillain that will go down in history or whatever. This show isn't offensively awful or anything, and if you're into this concept I'm sure you'd have a decent time with it. I'm not personally a fan of these settings however, and I thought pretty much every character seemed dull. There was nothing pulling me in, and so I just ended up getting bored, and I imagine most people would have a similar reaction. Even if you are a fan of this premise, there are other shows that do it far better. I wasn't a huge fan of Hamefura either, but with that show I at least managed to get through 2 full seasons of it. So maybe go watch that instead if this concept sounds interesting to you. Nageki no Bourei wa Intai shitai is another one of these generic and dull fantasy shows that smaller studios in Japan seem to be obsessed with for some reason. The premise here is that our main dude wants to retire from his super strong adventuring party, but his party friends just won't let him, or something like that. I don't know, I really wasn't paying very much attention, my interest had already faded somewhere in the first minute on account of this incredibly uninspired visual look that pervades so many of these shows. The characters are boring, the character designs are ugly, and the dialogues will put you to sleep if they don't make you groan in agony first. Don't watch this. Even if you love this kind of fantasy show, just go rewatch any other fantasy show instead. Reis wa Tanin ga follows a crazy lady who sells her kidney so that she can keep sticking around some violent yakuza dude whom she was forced into an arranged marriage with. This brief synopsis likely has many errors, as I just barely managed to keep up with what was happening when watching this at 4 times speed. I can however confidently say that nothing happened in this episode that caught my eye enough for me to feel like I should slow down the playback speed and pay more attention. There's certainly lots of wacky shit going on here, and I do respect that amidst other shows that just rehash the same isekai or fantasy formula again and again, but just because it's wacky that doesn't mean it's compelling. So this main lady gets married away to some yakuza guy who seems friendly and nice at first, but then turns out to be a total crazy person. But apparently main lady cannot leave this dude, but she also has to make money and earn her keep to stay, and so she resorts to selling one of her kidneys. I'm really not following along with that thought process, but I guess I don't have first-hand experience with how arranged marriages with yakuza members work. My assumption was that maybe she could just get a normal job and earn a normal salary, but maybe that's not a valid choice here for some reason. I wouldn't say that this episode was completely awful, but none of the characters appealed to me personally, and the unhinged plot just made me confused. I won't be watching any more of this, but if the premise sounds interesting to you, then you could certainly do a lot worse than this show. Amagami-san Chi no Enmusubi is a harem show. This alone is likely enough to turn off a great deal of people, me included. But for the rest of you, this show is about some dude moving in with 3 hot girls, and he then spends all day walking in on them in inappropriate situations and falling over on top of them into all kinds of suggestive positions. Riveting content. Look, I love hot anime girls as much as anyone, but when the context is as vapid and shameless as it is here, then what is even the point? There are plenty of actually fantastic shows that have even more attractive anime girls in them, and if you just want the sexual aspects of this, then why don't you just go and watch porn instead? I don't know, I guess I just don't get it. To the show's credit, the girls are decently cute, but certainly not enough to make me sit through an entire season of 24-minute long episodes where absolutely nothing of value happens. Oh look, it's another fantasy show about a party of adventurers. No. This show has at least one small thing going for it, and that is how goddamn goofy it is. This is about some dude who is a supposedly weak talker class, which is essentially just something that applies buffs. And so the premise is that this weak underdog will somehow use his weakness to become super strong, and so on and so on. But this one scene where this dude's party fight a bunch of monsters was truly laughable, because apparently these people can't do anything at all unless this talker dude just tells them the most obvious shit ever. They keep shouting at him in a panic to give them orders, as if they can't figure out for themselves that they should maybe attack the enemies instead of just standing there. The visuals surrounding this main guy especially is also just comically edgy. And since this is a fantasy world, obviously there are also a bunch of video game elements, and obviously all of it is completely ridiculous. I had some mild chuckles laughing at all of the goofy talker nonsense, but don't watch this show, it isn't worth it. Okay, so I just did a word count on the script for this video, and it has way too many words already. I'm going to have to start really speedrunning through these bad shows so that the video doesn't end up being absurdly long, and this show here is an excellent place to start. Sayounara Ryuusei Konnichiwa Jinsei is another completely hollow fantasy show. Some dragon gets killed and then reincarnates as a human, and then pretty much nothing in particular happens. I remember hardly anything about this episode with one notable exception. This lady is kind of cute. That is all. Are you tired of fantasy shows about overpowered protagonists yet? Well, tough shit, because here's some more. Pati Karatsuiho etc is about some super strong healer dude looking for party members, but nobody wants to team up with him because of reasons that I forgot, even though he's super strong and whatever. Except this moderately cute girl, that is. They then spend the rest of the episode doing the same generic shit you've most likely seen dozens of times before. The end. Yarinaushi Rejo wa Ryuusei Heka wo Kouryaku is a show about some lady time traveling to change her unfortunate future where she gets betrayed or killed or something to that effect. This is another premise that I feel like I've seen a bunch of times before in recent years, but that's not important. What is important is that I didn't enjoy the setting here, nor did I enjoy the characters, the presentation, or anything at all really. I will say that the main girl's character design is reasonably cute, but that's about it. This is far from the worst episode in this list, but I still wouldn't consider myself entertained by it. In Mecha-ude, some dude stumbles upon a tower where some lady steals a cube from a bunch of edgy bad guys with goofy looking toys. Turns out this lady has funky toys of her own, and they have a pretty awkward little fight which causes her to drop this cube thing, making it fall off the building. After a whole lot of nothing happens, our main guy eventually finds this cube thing, and it turns out to be a sentient mechanical arm with an impressively obnoxious personality. This arm thing keeps whining to our main guy that he should bring it with him, and obviously he folds. After that, this red lady shows up again along with some bad guys who attack our main dude, and holy shit, is it Hiroyuki Sawano doing the music here? No, it can't be, surely there's no way. It is Hiroyuki Sawano doing the music, man, what in the... In this show of all shows. Man, that really bums me out, because I'm definitely not watching any more of this. To be clear, I don't actually hate the premise here, it's kind of like a budget kill a kill, but the way it is all executed is just beyond dull and uninteresting. Nothing has any personality in this show outside of the music. I am actually writing this as I am watching the episode, and I still couldn't tell you anything about the main guy. He's just that unremarkable. Also, I really hate how these arms look, they just look like plastic toys. But hey, I guess I got some cool songs out of it at least. Sawano also worked on the OP and ED songs for this show, and they're both pretty damn good. Man, are they doing more of this Hanako-kun spin-off thing. I watched all episodes of the previous part of this, and I can recall precisely 0 things about it. The only thing I remember is that the episodes consisted of these characters doing a whole lot of nothing, and since I wouldn't consider these characters to be all that interesting on their own, that's not exactly a recipe for success. I think the visual style of this show is super cool, but there's just nothing else for me to appreciate here. Gokon ni Itara Onnaga Inakatta Hanashi is a show where some guys go to a mixer where all of the girls are cross-dressing as dudes. That's quite the peculiar premise, but honestly this show isn't really all that bad for what it is. I'm certainly not the target demographic here, and I won't be watching any more of this, but I can definitely see how people might have a good time with the wacky comedy that this show provides. The presentation is strong enough, and the characters are actually not completely terrible. If this sounds like a fun concept to you, go check this one out maybe. Yokai Gakko no Sensei Hajimemashita is a show where some absolute wimp of a teacher starts working at a school for yokai, which are basically supernatural monster things from Japanese folklore. This is a comedy show where the teacher is bothered by pretty much everything that ever happens, as he gets pushed around by all of the quirky students in various ways. A lot of this just boils down to characters being loud and obnoxious in response to all of the totally wacky things going on, and this just didn't end up appealing to my own preferences. Definitely not the worst show in this list though, but it's not something that I think you should go out of your way to watch. This show was actually borderline watchable. Acro Trip is a magical girl show where some young lady moves to the countryside and becomes super enamored with the local magical girl there. She then bumps into the villain of this town, who tries to force her to help him come up with better plans for taking down the magical girl, since he's completely terrible at it. The biggest problem with this show is simply that it's very run-of-the-mill. There's very little that sticks out in a strong way, but that goes for both good and bad things. The premise that the villain and this main girl will reluctantly work together seems mildly fun, but mildly fun just isn't cutting it when there's so much else airing every season. I could see myself watching more of this, but not when time is such a limited resource. Mahotsukai ni Naranakatta Onna Noko no Hanashi is about a girl who wants to be a magician but didn't get into the magic class that she really wanted to take, or something like that. The visual style of this show is pretty unique, and there's a lot of really unusual and creative character designs here. As with many other shows in this list, however, this one suffers from just simply being boring. There's not much that stands out to me about the characters, the plot, or the setting, and I actually barely even remember anything that happened. I had to skim through the episode again to even write out this much to say. But I mean, at least it didn't actively piss me off, I suppose. If you just really need your magical school fix, then maybe this show can help you out. Kinoko Inu is a super sappy show about some author whose dog has just passed away. A super sad situation to be sure, but there's pretty much no subtlety here at all, and so it just ends up feeling like a cheap attempt to elicit sympathy from the viewer. Anyway, a mushroom dog later grows in this dude's yard and then everything is cool beans again. I honestly think it's incredibly impressive how they managed to drag this episode out to last a full 24 minutes, because I'm absolutely certain that you could easily condense this down into just 3 or 4 minutes while still keeping everything that actually mattered. That is to say, there's an insane amount of empty space in this episode and things progress painfully slowly. Watch this if you need to fall asleep maybe, otherwise you should probably pass on this one. Puniru wa Kawaii Suraimu is a gag comedy show where some magical slime girl keeps bothering the main dude in weird and wacky ways. This one actually wasn't too far out of line of my own tastes, and I actually found myself mildly amused from time to time. There's a moderately charming dynamic between the slime lady and the main dude, and some of the jokes managed to sort of land for me. The problem here, however, is once again that moderately entertaining isn't good enough. I might have watched more of this in a parallel universe where there wasn't a million new shows airing every season, but that is not the reality we live in. By the way, Giga and Teddy Lloyd apparently worked on the ED song for this show, and it unironically goes pretty hard. Definitely worth a listen even if the show isn't worth a watch. Whew. Well, I'm glad that's over. So now you know what to watch and what to avoid, assuming your preferences are anything like mine, but what about the shows that fall somewhere in the middle? This is arguably the least interesting category, but in certain ways it may still have a decent amount of value. Sometimes people just want more of a specific setting or genre, but there won't always be a super mainstream big budget production doing that thing. And if that is the case, there is a decent chance that you might find something if you go diving into the more obscure candidates. And if all you want is to see a certain premise or setting, then maybe the overall quality of the production can be overlooked to some degree. We all have a soft spot for something. If your cup of tea is drama and suffering, then I can totally see how Re:Zero would fit that bill and how it could be an entertaining ride in spite of its cheap and shameless nature. I'll be honest, even I had a pretty good time with the first season of this series. It was fun seeing Subaru die over and over again, and the over-the-top presentation did succeed in making me feel pretty entertained. Whether or not Re:Zero as a show is good or bad overall is a topic beyond the scope of this little segment, so I'll try to swiftly move along. I had a decent time with the first season, but both parts of season 2 are among the most painfully boring and obnoxious experiences that I've ever forced upon myself. So when I saw that the first episode of this new season was a goddamn hour and a half, I promptly abandoned the mission and left my couch in dismay, having every intention to just leave it be. But sunk cost fallacy is a real bitch if you're anything like me, so eventually I decided that I had come too far with this series to give up on it now, and so I watched it anyway a few days later. And what do you know? So far, it's actually a substantial step up from the absolute train wreck that we were subjected to in the previous season. The locale is far more interesting, the characters aren't quite as obnoxious, and the overall pacing is actually not completely insufferable. Yet. Judging by the end of this episode, it looks like we're even going to be getting to see more of Subaru dying and having a bad time. Cool. It looks like this season might more closely resemble what we got in season 1, and that's a very welcome change in my book. Of course, it is still Re:Zero, so we're still not safe from some truly awful scenes and some remarkably terrible dialogue. This garbage between these dudes and this red lady was truly agonizing, and this villain person at the end is just a total edgelord. But I guess that's just par for the course here. I guess I don't know about anyone else, but this certainly doesn't come across as intimidating or unsettling to me. This is just embarrassing, and even worse than that, this drags on for way too goddamn long. It was like they had to pad the episode out for runtime or something, but surely that couldn't be the case since the episode was already such an unusual length. This lady keeps spouting edgy garbage for what feels like half an hour before she finally gets her shit over with and allows the episode to end. This is still definitely an improvement over the second season, but even at its best, this series never had much to offer beneath the superficial surface. But sometimes people just want to see a dude suffer, and I guess I can get behind that. I do suppose that is kind of fun every once in a while. Uzumaki is an interesting show to me, mostly because I'm having a pretty good time with it, but likely for all of the wrong reasons. On the surface, it would seem that Uzumaki aims to be some sort of psychological horror show, as would be suggested by the genre tags. But to me, it instead manages to be a very effective comedy, much more so than any actual comedy that is currently airing in this season. The most striking aspect of this show will undoubtedly be the unique visual style, which is famously adapted from the original graphic novel by Junji Ito. I haven't read the original work, so I cannot speak on how it was adapted into animation, but I have to assume that it doesn't share this same comical absurdity. The thing about horror is that it has to straddle a pretty fine line with its intensity to avoid it becoming overdone, and this same thing will of course apply to almost everything to a certain extent. But this tends to be especially true for horror, as it is a genre that typically relies heavily on carefully building up suspension before delivering an effective payoff. We are usually more easily frightened when the mood slowly lures us into a certain state of mind, only to then take advantage of that by presenting something that strongly contrasts with it, such as an especially gory scene or maybe some kind of loud jump scare. Emotions of all kinds become stronger when there is a clear contrast that they exist alongside. Uzumaki very much does not do this thing. Instead, it seems to adopt the ideology of shocking the audience not by going back and forth between shocking and calm moments, but instead by just spamming more and more shocking moments of escalating intensity. It just keeps cranking up that dial of crazy shit, and it really doesn't take long before it stops being unsettling and instead just becomes completely absurd. This whole thing actually reminds me heavily of something that Serj Tankian, vocalist of System of a Down, said somewhere about how he felt that when metal gets too hard, it just becomes funny, while also comparing this to horror movies and explaining how the same applies there. Anything will lose its effect if you shamelessly overdo it without any consideration for balance. But to be fair, I have no idea what the artist's intention is with the anime adaptation of Uzumaki. Maybe the point all along was to make something so absurd that it's just laughable, and in that case, great success. I am genuinely having a decent time with this show, and it's made me laugh out loud more than once in just these 3 episodes that is currently aired. But I wouldn't exactly consider it a strong piece of art on account of how uneven and messy it is in a great number of ways. At the very least, I am quite glad that they had the wisdom to only make this adaptation be 4 episodes long, rather than a more typical 12 or 13. This would definitely get extremely old if it would go on for any longer than these 4 episodes, so I think this is just the right length. I doubt this will leave a very memorable impression on me in the long run outside of the visual style, but I appreciate the laughs that I've had along the way. Watch this if you're looking for a goofy fun time, but you should maybe look elsewhere if you're looking for horror. This new Ranma 1/2 adaptation feels a bit daunting to categorize, as I'm likely overlooking a whole lot in my viewing. For those of you who aren't familiar with this work, this 2024 version of Ranma 1/2 is some sort of reboot of a show from 1989. As it so happens, I've never watched the original show, so indeed approaching this new one on the back of its long legacy likely puts me in a poor position to say much of value about it. But I suppose I'll give it my best shot either way. Maybe I'm not the only one who might give this new adaptation a chance without first having seen the old one. In this first episode, 3 sisters learn that one of them are set up to get married to some dude named Ranma. We then see Ranma spend several minutes fighting a big panda until he eventually arrives at their house and turns out to be a girl. Apparently, this dude turns into a girl if he comes in contact with cold water and reverts back to a guy in hot water, and that is basically the core premise. This episode had plenty of charm, and the production is certainly of high quality, as would maybe be expected since MAPPA is behind it. There's loads of cool animation cuts and cute expressions, and especially this purple hair lady is hella adorable. I'm not personally a huge fan of the style of comedy that is on display here, however. The entertainment value of seeing people get embarrassed while walking in on each other in the bath has certainly diminished for me over the years. The tone here heavily reminds me of the Urusei Yatsura reboot in a lot of ways, and even the overall visual aesthetic has a really similar feel, even though that reboot had a different studio. This dude even does the same hand gesture as the Urusei Yatsura MC when getting crushed here, so I'm certainly curious as to what that is all about. This familiar tone also strongly carries into the comedy, which isn't a great thing for me, as I'm not all that into the random gag style of humor that Urusei Yatsura had going. This is obviously just up to my personal preference, so your mileage may vary. Beyond the incompatible humor, I had a decent time with this episode, and I can easily see plenty of people enjoying it. When they're not cracking jokes, the dialogues are solid and the characters are plenty likable, especially Akane. I'll keep watching it for the time being, but I suspect that I might put it down a little bit further down the line, depending on how much focus will be put on the comedy aspects. I had some pretty mixed feelings about the first season of Blue Lock, but ended up really latching on to some of the comments it made regarding ego. I do sincerely believe that being egotistical has many benefits, and it's likely a really strong weapon to help people confidently work towards something they want and take their dreams for themselves, no matter the cost to those around them. This is obviously a pretty nuanced topic, and there's plenty of cases where this would be frowned upon, but in general I do think a lot of people, me included, could probably greatly benefit from being more egotistical. Anyway, I'm likely reading way too far into this because 95% of this show is far more shallow than what this intro would lead you to believe, but that remaining 5% has managed to keep me on the hook one way or another. As for the rest of the series, it's just a bunch of football being played by incredibly one-dimensional characters, all of which pretty much only have a single gimmick that defines their entire personality. The fact that a lot of these gimmicks are incredibly obnoxious is also not doing this show any favors. I do usually enjoy seeing characters give their all towards a lofty goal, but there's way too many things that get in the way of me appreciating this journey in Blue Lock. If not for the annoying characters, it is the absurdly overt presentation during trivial moments in the matches. The way this show hypes up even the smallest shit is probably super engaging to some people, but to me it's just tiring. I'm also really not fond of the overall visual look of this show, so honestly it would probably be in my best interest to just put this one down. But for now, I'll allow myself to be dragged along for a few more episodes. Kekkon surute hontou desu ka is a pretty cute show about two typical working adults getting into a fake marriage for the sake of not being shipped off to Alaska as a part of their job. Our two main characters are working at some sort of travel agency that will be opening a branch in Alaska in 1 year's time, and somebody has to be the one to relocate over there and take up the reins. Specifically, someone who is unmarried so that they don't have too many ties holding them in Japan. Shockingly, neither of our main characters are too interested in relocating to Alaska, so on a whim, this lady suggests the idea that they both get into a fake marriage for the sake of avoiding this disaster. That is basically the core premise, and what follows is a pretty damn charming show about two awkward people trying to navigate this strange situation. There's plenty of fun scenes here, the dialogues are well written, and the characters are all around entertaining. The show really does have a good amount of personality, and I had a pretty damn good time with this first episode. I can however very easily see this get stale as the show goes on, and there really aren't all that many moving parts to this story, at least not at this point in time. This series is clearly more focused on the characters than on the plot, and I imagine the main appeal will simply be to see these people get closer until they eventually become affectionate with each other for real. If you're in the mood for a cozy romance show, then this is a decent pick, but if your time is limited, go watch No Hako instead. Kimi wa Meido-sama is about some assassin lady who begins working for some normal typical dude who has no needs for her assassination services. Her background is apparently that of a trained killer who knows very little of the world beyond that profession, and so the focus of the story is on her pretty much learning how to be human and how to appreciate a typical life now that she's no longer bound by her prior duty. She's sort of like Yoru from Spy Family, but unlike Yoru, this maid lady is actually rather likable. There are some fairly wholesome moments here where she gradually grows less cold and starts appreciating the warmth of being with someone who is actually a half-decent human being. Seeing her get all excited over eating tasty food and such has a certain amount of charm, but nothing in this episode left too big of an impression on me. This show is definitely up my alley in a lot of ways. I do love cute shit like this, but this is another case where it just won't cut it for a show to be moderately enjoyable. I do think this series just barely lands on the right side of that fence, so I do think I'll give this one at least a few more episodes. But I can easily see this get old if the formula doesn't meaningfully develop as the show goes on. If you're in the mood for a wholesome slice of life show, maybe you could check this one out. Also, the animation in this opening goes needlessly hard for some reason. I respect that. Tsuma Shougakusei ni Naru is certainly a very interesting title that I'm sure would leave many with a rather confused look. If they understood Japanese. The English title is If My Wife Becomes an Elementary School Student, which is slightly less strange than the original Japanese title, but I hope you get my point. In this show, the wife in a family of 3 dies but then reincarnates in a newborn body the same day it seems. The family doesn't meet her again until 10 years later however, at which point they have a big reunion and celebrate the odd situation. To my surprise, this show ended up being fairly cute and charming. The 10-year-old wife is voiced by Yuki Aoi, who really carries this show by a great deal. This girl also has a lot of fun expressions, and it is pretty entertaining seeing her be so smug and assertive on account of her being far older mentally. There's not a whole lot else that managed to hook me in however, so I can't imagine finishing 12 episodes of this. The father and the kid are both fairly unremarkable, and while the child wife was cool, she can't carry the entire production on her own. For what it's worth, the show seems to be aiming for a much more wholesome tone than what the title might suggest. Much of the focus is spent on the family just appreciating the fact that their lost family member is magically back, and the pain of their loss and the joy in their relief is communicated fairly well. If you want a cute show about the family doing wholesome things together, then this will probably fit the bill reasonably well, but I'll be leaving this one here. I had a pretty decent time with the first season of MF Ghost, but I'm probably not the most qualified individual to comment on the quality of this series. I still haven't gotten around to watching Initial D, and I'm not exactly much of a car guy. I do think the racing in the past season was plenty entertaining though, and I'm so on board for all of the cool Eurobeat that we got. I added so many great songs to my playlist as that season went on, and I hope to discover even more cool shit this time around. But as goes for the actual show, it is very clear that the racing is more or less the entire focus. Occasionally there is an episode here and there where the main dude goes and does something with this cute lady, so I guess there is some small hint of a romantic subplot there, but the characters are hardly deep in this show. If you're watching this show, you're watching it for the racing. Or well, it's either that or the Angel Girls. If you like racing shows and Eurobeat, then this one is pretty alright. Go watch it if that fits your criteria. I will be sticking with it too. Holy shit, we're still getting more Love Live shows. I have watched the previous seasons of Love Live Superstar, but I remember basically nothing. These Love Live shows are a pretty good example of something that really pushes my buttons by appealing to some very subjective preferences of mine, but while not actually being very good at all. See, I love music stuff and I also love cute anime girls. And guess what? This show has both of those things. Especially the girls part, we've got some really cute girls in this show and the animation goes really far to highlight this wonderfully. I actually adore the visual presentation in Love Live Superstar as it's incredibly vivid and colorful. The character designs are also really sharp and well defined, and the backgrounds are often super beautiful. Superficially, this show is pretty fire, but in terms of pretty much everything that relates to the substance, it leaves a lot to be desired. This is another one of those shows where basically every character is defined by just a single gimmick. With the exception of the main girl, pretty much all of them only has as much personality as what could be described in a single sentence, and even the main character isn't all that much better here. The overall plot is also incredibly predictable, so a lot of the time the show just feels like it is on autopilot according to a pre-made template or something. Which is probably not far from the truth at all, since pretty much all of these Love Live shows end up being very similar, likely by design. If you have watched Love Live since the first show like me, then you will probably be sticking with it just for the sake of it, same as me. But if you have never seen any of these, I'd say you're not missing out on much. Except for some pretty cool visuals here and there, but you can find that in lots of other places. Since I am talking about Love Live, I want to take this opportunity to bitch about something that has annoyed me ever since the first Love Live show. Where in the hell are these girls getting their music from? Yes, we do sometimes see small glimpses of the writing process when they are writing the songs, and occasionally we even get to hear a demo version before we hear the final mix. But how in the hell do we go from a simple demo arrangement with piano and vocals or guitar and vocals to a fully produced, professionally mixed master track with tons of electric guitar, drums, harmonies, synths, brass and just all kinds of other shit? Where do these high school girls record these songs? Who mixes them? Who plays all the instruments? Hello show, you can't just gloss over this stuff, okay? Or well, I guess it can. To my great dismay. Anyway, you probably shouldn't watch Love Live. Okay, bye. Wow, we're at the final show. I can't believe it. Trillion Game is kind of unhinged and honestly I'm not even sure how I feel about it. Visually, this show looks like a total train wreck a lot of the time and the chain of events often barely even makes sense. But as someone who has the occasional daydream of running a business someday, this series here managed to sort of scratch that itch. Oh right, yes, this show is about business, to some extent. So this nerdy dude is socially awkward and can't land a job despite having all the technical competence for it. Meanwhile, this guy has no technical competence but is very socially outgoing and ends up getting jobs just because he's superficially likable. This already is an interesting mirror to the real world because this is basically how it works. If you need to get through an interview, how competent you are for the job basically doesn't matter at all. It's how socially compatible you are that matters. Even outside of the context of an interview, it is shocking how many people there are in higher ranking positions that at the very best are mediocre at their jobs, if not downright incompetent. But this isn't what matters if you want to climb the ranks. You've gotta be likable, not competent. Anyway, back to anime for a moment. This social guy tells the nerdy dude that they should start a business together and make all of the big bucks. $1 trillion to be specific. I'd totally love to see a show about a small group of people running a small business and slowly growing it. That actually sounds super cool and I had never thought about it before. I'm really not sure if this is the show for that though, because it doesn't take long until they start looking for people to invest multi-million-dollar sums into their startup. Which is something that seems like it would be just a tad bit unrealistic in the real world. Our two main characters have a pretty entertaining dynamic in the sense that the nerdy dude is rational and realistic while the social dude is incredibly greedy and ambitious. There's a fair few scenes where these qualities clash in some pretty funny ways, and I found myself being surprisingly engaged by this show even though it also feels very cheap in many areas. As I mentioned near the start, I'm actually not even sure how I feel about this one. I will be watching more of this for now though. If any of this sounds like any fun to you, maybe you could also give this first episode a go in spite of the very off-putting veneer. And that was the last show. I can't believe I've made it all the way to the end. I can finally go outside again. I've done my best to try to cover every single new show that has aired in this new fall season, but I'm sure a few will have managed to slip through the cracks. There's just too much airing these days. So how are you all enjoying this new season? What shows are you most enjoying? I'm personally pretty damn pleased with the current lineup. Having Dandadan, No Hako and Chikyuu no Undou ni Tsuite to look forward to every week is super cool. But for now though, I've gotta get this video edited and uploaded before that new Factorio expansion releases, because at that point I probably won't be productive again for a long time. Big thanks for watching my stuff. I hope you have a cool day, and see you in the next video maybe.